Not every gardener has a perfect south-facing sunny spot to grow their vegetables. Most of us have some shady corners in our gardens, and today we'll talk about what we can grow in those places. And the first category of plants that can grow in partial shade are brassicas or cabbage family. Everybody knows that brassicas love spring, cold weather, and sometimes we don't have enough spring to grow them to full maturity. If we plant them in full sun, they will get too hot when the summer comes. Cauliflower needs at least some shade to go through the blanching process that turns heads white. And a bit of morning sun with some afternoon shade is the perfect combination. Brassicas are cold tolerant and should be started like 10-12 weeks prior to your last frost date. Brassicas that form heads, things like regular cabbage, cauliflower and broccoli, they have tighter heads and flower later when grown in partial shade. And leafy brassicas, things like kale and Chinese cabbage, they are not as cabbagey in flavor when grown in shade. I've noticed that if I grow kale in a fully sunny location, it gets bitter sometimes. Also, radishes belong to Brassica family, and they are root vegetables, so they do not require as much sun as some of other veggies. I've grown radishes in partial shade and they've done just fine. So give them a try. Another thing that can be grown in partial to full shade is mushrooms. Mushrooms are not your typical vegetable, but it's still edible. And they are so easy to grow. If you have shade in your garden, then you must grow mushrooms. One of the easiest mushrooms to grow in the garden is King Stropharia, also known as wine cap mushrooms, or they're also called red wine cap mushrooms. I love these mushrooms. They taste just like your typical portobello mushrooms that you get at the grocery store, but they are so much fun. First of all, they add color and interest to your garden. It's not just greens and leaves. Suddenly you see mushrooms growing, and it's so much fun. Kids love picking mushrooms when they see them in the garden. Of course, you have to train them, make sure they know what to pick, because there are other mushrooms growing which are not always edible. In order to plant your mushrooms, you will have to purchase one time. You will have to order a kit, which is a sawdust spawn, and it usually comes in a plastic bag. I got 5 pounds of it, and I just sprinkled that sawdust spawn all over wood chips in my garden, because every spring I do some mulching, and after I mulched I sprinkled sawdust spawn, and next fall they were growing. You would be surprised, but you can grow currants in partial shade. Most people think that berries need full sun, but that may be the case for other berries, but not for currants. Currants actually love shade, otherwise they will not be juicy at all. They'll be kind of dry, and you don't want that in your berries. So try growing currants in partial shade and you will see the difference. I have mine growing under the grapevine. Another thing you can grow in partial or even full shade is rhubarb. Also, Swiss chard. They are kind of similar in looks, that's why I placed them next to each other. Swiss chard is one of those veggies that it doesn't care where you plant it. I've grown it in full shade, in full sun, in partial sun, and it just grows well anywhere. Potatoes can also be grown in partial shade. I've noticed that those potatoes that I planted in full sun, they grew a bunch of leaves and not enough root vegetables. So the only ones that gave me a lot of harvest were those that were grown in some shade or like partial shade. So now I am planning to grow my potatoes that way. Root vegetables in general grow well in the shade, and that includes not just radishes and potatoes, also turnips, carrots, rutabagas, beets, and others. Great way of catching shady locations in your garden is to grow potatoes in grow bags, and that way you can move them where you want them to be. So sometimes I place them in a spot that I think is shady, but then I notice it gets a lot of afternoon sun. So I have to move it, and it's easy to do it because I grow it in grow bags. And the last category I would like to talk about is leafy greens. Everybody knows that they can tolerate the shade, and I would like to talk a bit more about it. So this category includes lettuce, spinach, collards, mustard greens, and others. I found that similar to brassicas, lettuce, if grown in shade, doesn't get bitter. But if you plant it in the sunny location, it will start getting some bitterness toward the end of the season. Same with spinach. Spinach gets kind of tough and rough when it's grown in full sun, but when it has some shade, then it remains crispy and juicy. Also, your leafy greens will not bolt as easily when they are grown in partial shade. And beside your annual leafy greens, you can also grow some perennials in the shade. Things like sorrel, also red veined sorrel can tolerate the shade as well. Most leafy greens are cold tolerant, and you can sow them early in the spring as soon as the soil can be worked. For me, it's usually beginning of March, and most of the things do so well in cold temperatures. For example, these Asian greens like mibuna and mizuna, they start bolting as soon as the heat of the summer comes, but during spring months they thrive and they produce so much. So I always try to plant as much as I can in the early spring. Some culinary or even medicinal herbs can also tolerate some shade. For example, sage does so well in shade, and things like cilantro and parsley are slower to bolt if grown in partial shade. And the best herb that I find to grow in shade is basil. Basil loves to go to flower as soon as the hot weather starts, and I don't like that. I want to continue harvesting basil. So I try to grow it in some shady corners. I grow basil in containers most of the time, and I just put it under my grapevine to prevent it from bolting. So that was my recommendations for your shade garden. I hope you found some of it being useful, and thank you so much for watching and supporting this channel.